Part 2. Murder by Design. The Psychology of Bloodlust. On serial killers, toxic masculinity, and ethical dilemmas. We love killing, which is great, because we need to kill to survive. Hungry, kill something to eat. Sick? Kill the bacteria before they kill you. Threatened by something? Kill in self-defense. Not sure what it is? Kill it just in case. We love killing so much that our species is referred to as a super predator. This is because humans kill more in terms of quantity and diversity than any other predator. According to a 2015 review of behaviors by different kinds of predators, the conservation scientist Chris Diamond and colleagues concluded that humans kill so much that we alter ecological and evolutionary processes globally. The team also concluded that we kill so much that it is unsustainable. While all this killing is going on, there is one kind of killing that we care about the most, which is killing members of our own species. But we care about it in a weird way. While on the one hand we condemn murder, many of us fantasize about it. Some of us fantasize about throwing our boss outside the window, about forever silencing that screaming baby, or dream about a scenario where we stab an ex-lover right in the heart. I regularly feel like I want to kill people, just a little bit, especially when they are dawdling at airports. The normality of murder fantasies, or homicidal ideation, as it's sometimes referred to by researchers, was first established by Douglas Kenrick and Virgil Sheets at Arizona State University. Back in 1993, these two psychological scientists asked participants whether they had ever had a murder fantasy. Perhaps surprisingly, the majority said yes. In their first study, in fact, 73% of men and 66% of women said yes, to confirm that this wasn't just a particularly murderous sample, and to gather some more details about what the fantasies focused on, a second study was conducted. Similar rates were found. This time, 79% of men and 58% of women claimed that they had murder fantasies. Who did the participants want to kill? Men were more likely to imagine killing strangers and co-workers, while women preferred family members. Another popular target group were step-parents, like a horror movie version of Cinderella. Why does this happen? According to scientists Joshua Dontley and David Buss, fantasizing about killing is an evolutionary strategy, one with questionable usefulness in much of the modern world. It's part of our evolved psychological design. Murder fantasies are a product of the human capacity for abstract thought and hypothetical planning. If I did this, what will happen? They allow us to play out entire scenarios. They help us to always be prepared for the worst and to entertain ways of improving our quality of life by getting rid of people who stand between us and our goals. And it is when we mentally rehearse these situations that most of us quickly realize murdering someone probably isn't what we actually want to do, because we don't want devastating consequences. Those who don't have the capacity to mentally test potential future behaviors and their likely consequences might act more impulsively and live to regret it. As we will learn, dealing impulsively with frustration is a major contributor to murder, but some of us don't just fantasize about murder, we actually go through with it. So, who are these people? Why do people murder each other? If we ask our evolutionary psychologists Dontley and Buss, they would argue that this is because sometimes it makes sense to kill people, at least from an evolutionary standpoint. Humans murder because they have been designed to do so. According to their homicide adaptation theory, when we weigh the costs and benefits of killing another member of our species, there is quite a bit that can be gained from killing, particularly for men. In a paper they published in 2011, they write, killing historically conferred larger fitness benefits, preventing premature death, removing cost-inflicting rivals, gaining resources, aborting rivals, prenatal offspring, eliminating stepchildren, and winnowing future competitors of one's children. Although risky, as murder is often detected and can endanger the person who murders, they conclude that murder was at times still a winning strategy. Before we continue, let's talk about definitions. The term murder is typically used to describe the unlawful killing of another person. In other words, it doesn't include killing in self-defense or in state-sanctioned situations like the death penalty or in war. The death can be the result of wanting to kill the person or wanting to hurt them really badly and it resulting in their death. This is a necessary menstruary, which is called guilty mind, for a killing to be regarded as murder. A broader term is homicide. This typically includes both murder and manslaughter, the latter of which is a lesser crime that still involves killing another person, but in which either A. there was intention to kill, but there are mitigating factors such as loss of control or diminished responsibility, voluntary manslaughter, or B. there was no intention to kill, but there was gross negligence, or the killing happened as part of another inherently criminal and dangerous act, which is called involuntary manslaughter. This will only touch on in passing. Exact differences between manslaughter, murder, and homicide can be complicated and differ between countries, so when I use the term homicide, I'm going to use the same definition as 2013 United Nations Global Review on Homicide, arguably the most comprehensive such review to date. They define it as unlawful death purposefully inflicted on a person by another person, meaning intentional and unlawful murder. The UN report makes it clear that it is important to study homicide not just because it's the ultimate crime, but because it creates a ripple effect which goes far beyond the loss of life and can create a climate of fear and uncertainty. Homicide rates can affect entire communities, making people scared to go out at night or to visit certain neighborhoods. The report highlights that homicide also victimizes a family and the community of the victim, who can be considered secondary victims. It's not just the person who is killed that matters, but their families and friends who have to suffer the consequences. Compared to other kinds of crime, studying murder is relatively easy. If a person is killed, found dead, or goes missing, the chance of this being reported is very high, and the dark figure, the number of unreported crimes, is quite low. This stands in contrast to crimes such as rape and sexual abuse, for which we often have very few records, resulting in a very large dark figure. Because of this, according to the UN report, it's the most readily measurable, clearly defined, and most comparable indicator for measuring violent death around the world. The report further states that this transparency makes homicide both a reasonable proxy for violent crime as well as a robust indicator of levels of security within states. According to the UN review in 2012, almost 5,437,000 people were murdered around the world. This rate has fluctuated over time. While the media might have us believe otherwise, we can see from the study that after a peak between 1991 and 1993, recorded homicide rates have since generally dropped around the world. Then, from a graphical representation of their findings, we can also see that there are enormous differences in homicide rates in different parts of the world, with the Americas having a rate that is about 10 times higher than Europe and Asia, Oceania. This doesn't mean that people in different countries are inherently more violent, but is instead due to the complex interplay of social factors. Murder rates can differ in relation to the affluence of the countries, their GDP, culture and oppression, political or social conflict, and access to weapons. Particularly in places like the USA, easy access to guns is often seen as a major contributor to murder rates. The report also looked into the types of people who commit homicides. Most murder is committed by men against men, with an astonishing 95% of perpetrators and 79% of victims being male. We also know that most people who commit murder in terms of raw murders live in the Americas. Favorite murder weapons differ based on country. In the Americas, 66% of murders are committed with a firearm. These convicted of murder elsewhere in the world are more likely to use sharp objects like knives or other ways of killing, including using blunt objects, physical force, or poison. Finally, when men kill women, the women they kill are likely to be their intimate partners or family members. While 40% of females were killed by intimate partners or family members in 2012, only 6% of men were. This gives us a very basic picture of what homicide looks like around the world, but it doesn't answer the far more interesting question of why people kill each other. To this we turn next. The banality of murder. I really dislike typologies that try to label people who have committed murder based on the crime scenes they have behind or their perceived subconscious motivations. By golly, I think this murderer is motivated by power. He probably still lives with his mom. Clearly, he is a deranged psychopath. I partially blame TV shows for making it seem that this kind of offended profiling is interesting or useful. I think it's neither. However, I do rather that like a functional typology. In this regard, what researchers Albert Roberts and colleagues put together in a paper published in 2007 bears examination. Here they argue that homicide is not a homogeneous behavior. Homicide perpetrators are not the same in terms of motivation, environmental factors, demographics, and interpersonal dynamics. Different factors of complex combinations precipitate homicides. Note that their taxonomy leaves out murders committed for political reasons. Despite this complexity, they found that most homicides fit quite well into a fourfold typology that is based only on the most essential elements of the crime. The first type is altercation or argument precipitated homicides. In other words, fights which escalated, sometimes for ridiculous reasons. They are impulsive responses to minor frustrations. Some examples taken from the paper include argument and fight over $4, victim died from beating. Defendant hit victim in the head with a 2x4 because they were fighting over a bike. Shot victim over argument over dog. Shot victim after argument over glasses. Beating victim with a bat and dumped his body in the woods. Argued over drugs. Defendant shot victim after some altercation they had earlier in the day, and beating a victim with baseball bat over money. These seem like some pretty standard fights that got completely out of hand, and in the heat of the moment someone was killed. It's safe to say that response of murder in these situations is not proportionate to the magnitude of the argument. It goes to show that murder motives are based on the perception that the violence is justified in the moment, rather than what most people would see as a reasonable justification later on. The second type of homicide is felony homicide. This is where someone intentionally kills another during the commission of a serious crime. These murders are typically committed during a robbery, burglary, or kidnapping. Here, the ultimate goal is not to kill the person, but to get access to money or other gains. The person who is killed is either in the way, like when a perpetrator is trying to burgle a house and the owners happen to be home, or is part of the crime, like holding someone ransom and then killing them. Third are domestic violence or intimate partner violence induced homicides. Here, the people who have committed murder kill a family member or partner. Some examples of the motives are shot victim, he believed that she was unfaithful. Shot wife after she left him, stabbed his wife to death because he thought that she was cheating on him. Defendant used car to run over and killed husband who had beaten her badly. Shot and killed victim after years of emotional abuse. Defendant stabbed boyfriend in chest with kitchen knife after argument. These murders are not committed in order to gain money, but are due to the complexities of human emotion and power in relationships. Here, it seemed that our murder fantasies are closest to what ends up happening: killing an ex-boyfriend, stabbing someone who cheated on you, running over an abusive partner. These are the situations where our emotional pain translates into the desire to inflict physical pain on the other person. We may want cathartic release to make the other person hurt as much as or more than we do. The final type that Roberts and colleagues include are accident homicides. This exclusively involves killing people while driving under the influence of alcohol or other drugs. This last one is a bit of an odd one out Because it's the only type where the person doesn't actually intend to kill anyone. It also wouldn't fall within the definition given by the UN report, but does fall within the general idea of unlawful killing. However, as those who have lost someone as a result of recklessness of drunk driving will attest, losing someone this way is often not much different from having the victim stabbed or shot. Anger and desire for vengeance can be comparable, even if reasons for killing are not. When we think of a murderer, we think of a mugshot of a guy with a teardrop tattoo on his face, snarling at us. Instead, what this typology shows us is that situations in which homicides often occur are really quite mundane. Many of us have had a heated argument with a partner or felt slighted by someone who wouldn't pay back a small debt. The only difference seems to be that these murders happened when the perpetrator acted on what many of us just fantasize about. In the case of accident homicides, it's even more banal. Plenty of us might do exactly the same thing, getting into a car, drunk or high, but due to nothing other than luck, the consequences end up being completely different. Making matters even more complicated, most people who murder someone never murder anyone ever again. Reconviction rates for homicide, also known as recidivism rates, are very low. According to a review of the literature published in 2013 by forensic psychologist Marie Clem, studies that assess specific recidivism, committing another homicide alone find recidivism rates ranging from 1 to 3%. Can we really call someone who killed a person once in the heat of an argument a murderer for the rest of their life? Or were they just a murderer at the time they committed their crime? But before we address this, let's examine one of the curious facts of murder first. As both men and women are clearly capable of homicide, why are most murders committed by men? Toxic masculinity. Up until this point, I quite like the evolutionary argument. Homicide can be adaptive, but our evolutionary research friends, Dunkley and Buss, go on to argue something far more controversial. They argue that men, not women, have evolved bodies and minds designed to kill. They argue that this is because, over evolutionary time, the greater reproductive variance among men selected for more extreme and risky male strategies to acquire and retain mates. Sex differences in the use of risky strategies, such as violence and homicide, are an outcome of this unique selection pressure on men. Men who failed to take risks would have been a disadvantage in competition for mates and therefore less likely to leave descendants. Men, they argued, have more to gain genetically from murder than women. This doesn't excuse murder, of course, but it might help to explain why murder happens so often. In line with the idea that men are predisposed to aggression and thereby murder, a meta-analysis of research by John Archer in 2004 showed that direct, especially physical aggression, was more common in males than females at all ages sampled, was consistent across cultures, and occurred from early childhood on. Showing a peak between 20 and 30 years, the review found that this wasn't because men were angrier than women, but that the overall pattern indicated males' greater use of costly methods of aggression rather than a threshold difference in anger. Well, this fits with our evolutionary theories propose that men are more likely to take risks than women, including acting on aggressive and homicidal impulses. However, Archer also argues that the same data can support a more social view. He writes that while it could be that these differences are found around the world because men are born like this, the sex difference is characteristic of the human species. It could also be because of social roles. Gender roles are consistent across cultures. This is decidedly a more nuanced view. This brings me to my point of contention with evolutionary theories of aggression and murder. They can quite readily be used to argue, well, that's just how men are. To counter this, first of all, humans have the capacity for inhibition. This means men can choose to not act aggressively. Predispositions don't make some people commit murder. Their own decisions do that. It's a bit like the idea that guns don't kill people, people do. Second, maybe men murder more because society raises boys to be more disinhibited, aggressive, and physically active than girls. This is ample research on this, and I also have a relevant story that I want to share. I had a friend when I was growing up in Canada. Our status as best friends was consolidated on the first day of grade 3, when she gave me a colorful bangle and declared that we would be friends forever. Even though she lived almost an hour away, my parents regularly drove me to see her for playdates. On one such playdate, it was her 10th birthday. We had been told to wait in her bedroom until we were called. We were excited about what her parents had planned. They called us after what seemed like an eternity, and we came running into the living room, delighted to find a pile of beautifully wrapped presents waiting for my friend. Despite her excitement, she sat down obediently on the couch adjacent to the pile, waiting for her parents to allow her to proceed. Before she could even open the first one, her 5-year-old brother stormed into the pile and started tearing the presents apart. There was gift wrap everywhere. My friend couldn't contain her disappointment and started crying. While her parents sat by, idly clearly amused by the spectacle, they never interfered. My friend was devastated for weeks. Even at the time I recognized the double standard, it was my introduction to misogyny. Whenever people say that boys will be boys, that sexist comments are just locker-room talk, or that men are just naturally more violent than women, I think of stories like this one. Society often gives too much leeway to destructive, aggressive, and violent actions carried out by men. And this is bad for women, like my friend, whose birthday was ruined, but it might be even worse for men. When we rationalize male aggression as natural and normal, we accept that men are more likely to be convicted of crimes, end up in prison, and be victimized by other men. But why should our presence be filled with men? Is this not a disastrous situation for males? Gender inequality in how we educate boys and girls on violence and aggression is hugely problematic. If you want violence and murder rates to go down, this is something we can and must change. Social arguments aside, there is often one more factor that people bring up when they discuss gender differences in the commission of murder and other violent crime. It is the argument that testosterone hijacks men's brains and makes them act out. Let's look at the evidence about this. In 2001, James Dabbs and colleagues published a paper showing a correlation between the amount of testosterone in the saliva of people convicted of crime and the severity of their crimes. The more testosterone, the more ruthless the homicide. According to their study, this ruthlessness was shown because among inmates who committed homicide, those high in testosterone more often knew their victims and planned their crimes ahead of time. The acts were considered more ruthless when they weren't just reactive, but were more calculated and planned. Why? Neuroscientist Sarah Cooper and colleagues published a study in 2013 in which they examined this. They treated half of their sample of male rats with testosterone for 4 weeks, and then had them complete a task. They gave the rats the choice between 2 levers. One, which is safe, involved small amount of food, while the risky lever paired a large amount of food, with an increasing shock to the rat's feet. The testosterone-treated rats preferred the risky option. According to the researchers, increased preference for the large reward, despite risk of food shock, is consistent with increased risk of tolerance. The researchers did this study in part to help us better understand roid rage. When men who take certain steroids, anabolic androgenic steroids, which are synthetic derivatives of testosterone, act more impulsively and aggressively, they found that, in line with our evolutionary argument, higher levels of testosterone make some of us more likely to take risks. Risks like acting aggressively or murdering someone. Before I go on to explain that the link between testosterone and violence is actually a bit more complicated than these studies make it seem, I want to share with you the curious origin of the notion that testosterone and aggression are linked. It all started in 1849 with a German doctor, 6 cockerels, and a 4.5-page research paper. Here's what happened. On 2 August 1848, Arnold Berthold thought it was a good idea to cut off the tests of 6 male chickens to see what happened. For 2 cockerels, he detached one of the tests and left it loosely bobbing about next to the still attached one. He then removed both tests from the 4 other cocks. For 2 of these cocks, who we shall call Christian and Frederick, Berthold did something absolutely crazy. He surgically inserted Christian's testes into Frederick's intestines. Similarly, Christian got Frederick's intestine inserted into him. Medicine in the 1870s. According to his original paper, Berthold found that 2 cockerels who had their tests removed entirely were not aggressive and fought with other cockerels rarely, and then in a half-hearted manner. The 4 other cockerels exhibited normal behavior. They crowed lustily and often engaged in battle with each other and with other cockerels. He also found that the tests placed within the intestines of Christian and Frederick had attached themselves to the intestinal tissue. The doctor speculated that this must mean that something in the testes was absorbed by the blood and transferred to other parts of the body, causing aggression. Later, this substance became known as testosterone. This innocuous paper would go on to become the foundation of modern endocrinology, the study of the system that controls hormones. It would also go on to revolutionize how we think about aggression in males and the role of hormones in human violence. Seems pretty simple. Add testosterone, get more aggression. Remove testosterone, get less aggression. However, this notion has been repeatedly challenged, most recently by a review of the research in 2017 by Justin Kelly and colleagues. They found that the relationship between testosterone and aggressive behavior is much more complex than previously thought. After reviewing studies in humans and animals in and out of the lab, they concluded that despite evidence linking testosterone to human aggression and/or dominance behaviors, these relationships are either weak or inconsistent. So, the apparent truism that males are more violent and aggressive because of their testosterone levels may actually be overblown. The authors even suggest that we might have the testosterone aggression link somewhat backwards. What is potentially more interesting is how behavior affects the production of testosterone, and then how testosterone affects behavior. As the authors summarized, more robust is the finding that testosterone concentrations change rapidly in the context of human competition, and that such changes in testosterone concentrations positively predict ongoing and/or future human aggression. This means that as we compete with one another, our testosterone levels increase, and this increase can lead to more aggression. This is supported by a number of studies, most notably a series conducted on sport competitions. One of the first to show that competition increased testosterone levels was published by Alan Mazur and Theodore Lamb in 1980, and involved a small sample of male tennis players who showed an increase in testosterone after a victory and a drop after being defeated. Carré and his colleagues explained that this is because testosterone is highly responsive to competitive interactions. Winners typically have elevated testosterone concentrations relative to losers. They further explain that acute changes in testosterone may serve to promote competitive and aggressive behaviors. Perhaps testosterone may be better linked with the useful side of aggression, the side that helps us win competitions rather than more criminal forms of aggression. Testosterone helps us to earn Olympic medals and job promotions. So, next time you hear someone say that testosterone makes people violent, please correct them. I'm now going to switch gears a bit. It's time for some empathy exercises and a new question. When is homicide the right thing to do? Trilogy. Not all killing is created equal. For example, it may be justified to intentionally kill someone if you are a soldier, are acting in self-defense, are saving someone's life, and killing for the greater good. We kill for the greater good when we fight in the name of justice, freedom, or rights. So, when is killing bad? Some might argue when the harm caused by killing someone outweighs the benefits of doing so. Of course, the benefits that can come out of killing someone can be entirely subjective. To showcase this, let us use a classic thought experiment, the trolley problem. It has been modified in many ways over the years, but the modern version is typically credited to Philippa Foot in 1967. There is a whole body of research just on different types of the trolley problem, an area of study called trollology. Here is the general scenario. A trolley is running out of control down a railway track. In its path, 5 people are tied to the track by a madman. Fortunately, you can flip a switch and this will lead the trolley down a different track. Unfortunately, there is a single person tied to that track. Would you flip the switch? In moral dilemmas like this, both in written scenarios and in virtual reality situations, researchers find that the vast majority of us try to save as many people as possible. According to a paper published in 2014 by Alexander Skolmoisky and colleagues, in such situations, cognitive responses predominate due to impersonal nature of the situation. They argue that impersonal dilemmas lead most people to exert a utilitarian, or more broadly, consequentialist judgment. They tend to bring about the best overall consequences at the cost of the well-being of single individuals. This was even true when the scenario happened in virtual reality. In their own study, they had participants repeatedly complete a VR computer game where they had to decide whether to let a train they were controlling kill 10 people or to make it change track and kill 1 person. 96% of participants sacrificed 1 to save 10. Participants completed the scenario 10 times and most made the same decision every time. Greatest good for the greatest number was a general decision when they were being rational and impersonal. But the researcher then changed the scenario slightly and made the following appear. The trolley is running out of control down the track. There is a fork in the track. On the left side, there is a man standing on the tracks. On the right is a woman. Whichever path you choose, that person will be killed. Do you steer the train left or right? Skolmoisky and colleagues alternated where the man and the woman stood, but they found a general tendency towards sacrificing men. This was particularly true for male participants, 62% of whom killed or let die another man. The authors believed that this was because of social desirability. Protecting and saving a woman is seen as more favorable in the eyes of society than saving a man. It seemed that we don't just want ourselves to feel like we are doing the right thing, we also want others to agree that we made the most ethical decision. We want to look good, be praised, be seen as heroes, but this changes as soon as we make this situation personal. Let's try another variation. A trolley is running out of control down a track. In its path are 5 people who have been tied to the track by a madman. You are standing on a bridge over the track and there is a very large man standing next to you. If you push the large man off the bridge, you'll stop that train. He will die, but you will save the 5 people on the track. Do you push the large man off the bridge? If here you hesitated and thought that you couldn't live with yourself if you murdered someone with your bare hands, you are not alone. In comparable personal dilemma, we see that it requires direct physical force to sacrifice a single person. People tend to be more passive and let the 5 people die. Studies show that far fewer of us are willing to push someone than to pull a lever, even if the ultimate outcome for the person sacrificed, death, is the same. Let's change the situation one final time, in line with what researcher April Bleskresk and her colleagues did in 2010. Here are 4 variations that Bleskresk and her team would have given you had participated in her version of this thought experiment. A trolley is running out of control down a track. In its path are 5 people who have been tied to the track by a madman. Luckily, you can flip a switch that will lead the trolley down a different track. Version 1. Unfortunately, a 70-year-old female stranger is tied to that track. Version 2. Unfortunately, your 20-year-old male cousin is tied to that track. Version 3. Unfortunately, your 2-year-old daughter is tied to that track. And version 4. Unfortunately, your romantic partner is tied to that track. Do you save a stranger, your own daughter, the love of your life? The researchers found that, as expected, Men and women were less likely to sacrifice one life for 5 lives if the one hypothetical life was young, a genetic relative, or a current mate. When faced with personal sacrifices, emotional sacrifices, we quickly change how we think we should behave. We may feel that no lives are as important as the lives of our loved ones, even if we had to sacrifice 1,000 people to save our own child. We might morally, or at least instinctively, feel that it's the right thing to do. According to the neuroscientist Joshua Green and colleagues who have studied what moral decision-making looks like in the brain, the way we deal with this kind of dilemma changes because emotion plays such a big role in these decisions. When we are making moral decisions purely based on logic, on what they called controlled cognitive processes, we are more likely to make utilitarian decisions which maximize the greater good. However, automatic emotional responses like the emotions that go along with the thought of having to kill someone or losing a daughter can hijack this process. When we have this kind of emotional interference, we are far more likely to make judgments that are selfish. Rather than weighing up killing 5 people against killing 1, we weigh up the emotional impact on ourselves of killing our own daughter or letting 5 strangers die. But there's more that neuroscience can teach us about how these dilemmas look in the brain. In 2017, a team of scientists published a study reviewing all existing neuroscientific studies on moral decision-making and moral evaluations. They identified that some brain areas are commonly active when we make moral decisions, and they found that all types of moral decision-making involve increased activation of the left middle temporal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and cingulate gyrus. They also found that making one's own moral decisions involves different brain areas compared to judging the moral actions of others. Our brains react differently if we are asked whether we should save the drowning man or whether someone else should have him. In making our own moral decisions, we use 3 additional parts of the brain. Moral response decisions additionally activated the left and right middle temporal gyrus and the right proscenus. The last of these, the proscenus, is a brain region which is involved in higher level thinking, including thinking about what we are, the self, and the consciousness. Neuroscience has given us but a tiny glimpse into how humans make moral decisions. It has highlighted the role of emotions and how our brain needs to work harder to make decisions involving our own actions. There is, however, no specific part of the brain that makes us moral creatures. According to Garrigan and her colleagues, there appears to be no evidence for a uniquely moral brain, as brain areas that show increased activation during moral tasks are also involved in other functions. Even the exact role of emotion is still disputed, as is the applicability of hypothetical dilemmas to decisions that people need to make in reality. In reality, you probably wouldn't stop and think whether you should save your daughter. You would just jump in and do it. The 5 strangers would be unlikely to get much thought at all. So, if we look at killing from a hypothetical perspective, it seems that it's fine as long as it's in the name of the greater good or to save someone. This leads me to killing that is in a league of its own, committed by people who don't think they are doing the right thing and aren't working based on the socially desirable set of utilitarian rules set out by society. They plan their attacks, sometimes revel in them, and execute them with precision. These people aren't just caught in banal situations, murdering because a dispute got too heated or because they felt they had to kill the people for the greater good. I'm talking, of course, about serial killers. The Milwaukee Monster. In 1994, Jeffrey Jensen and colleagues from the Medical College of Wisconsin published a report based on their involvement as forensic experts in the case of the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Their involvement began on 23rd of July 1991 when police came across a naked and handcuffed young black man running down the middle of the street. The man took them to the house of Jeffrey Dahmer, where they found several human body parts. They called the Milwaukee Medical Examiner's Office, who started an investigation of the scene. Dahmer immediately cooperated and even helped the team to understand how he committed the murders. According to the report, Dahmer lived in a small, cramped, sparsely furnished single-bedroom apartment. The apartment itself was clean, well-maintained, and relatively odorless. As the forensics team worked their way through the small apartment, they found a shocking amount of body parts. Human heads were found in his freezer and fridge, along with dissected human hearts, a torso, and according to the report, a plastic bag containing 31 sections of skin. Skin pieces were irregular but somewhat square. They found a cooking pot with the hands and genitals of one victim, and clean skulls in the kitchen cabins and bedroom. They found more body parts, 5 skulls, and clean skeleton, an intact scalp and hair, and desiccated genitalia that had been painted a Caucasian flesh tone. Helpfully, for the forensics teams, Dahmer had even put together a photo album entitled Photographic Diary, and neatly displayed and catalogued the Polaroids of the victims before they were killed and in various stages of the dismemberment. During the autopsies, the forensics team noticed something even weirder: neatly drilled holes in some of the victims' skulls and evidence that acid had been injected into their brains before death. Upon speaking to Dahmer, they found that this was an attempt to render the victims helpless and use them as involuntary zombies. The 31-year-old Dahmer, it seems, was trying to make himself a sex zombie. Dahmer was found to be sane by 2 juries and was convicted of murdering 16 young men. He had lured them back to his apartment, drugged them, raped them, cut them into pieces, preserved the body parts by boiling or freezing them, and kept photos of the process as mementos to keep him company. If there was an evil checklist, he would tick all the boxes. But was he evil? Relatives of his victims called him Satan. The judge sentenced him to 15 life sentences, just to be sure, in case he survives the first one. And Dahmer himself said that he wished he could be given the death penalty for the suffering he caused. In some ways, his wish was granted, when only 2 years after being imprisoned, one of his prison mates blood-gowned him to death with a broomstick. Dahmer was found in a pool of his own blood in the prison toilets. The murderer was murdered by another convicted murderer. It's difficult to come up with any explanation of his behaviors. He seemed entirely motivated by his own gratification and sexual desires, but the softer side of him seemed to just want a companion. He said himself that part of the reason he killed his victims and kept the bodies was because he was lonely and didn't want them to leave. Did he have a broken brain? Was he missing empathy? We don't know, but we do know that he was found sane in psychological assessments, seemed to understand that what he was doing was wrong, and empathized with his victims, yet he was able to overcome all of these inhibitions because, according to him, he was so lonely. Loneliness is a relatable human characteristic, even if serial killer murderer is not. Going a step further, we could look at the bigger picture, society and cultural factors that might lead someone feeling so lonely, and why, for example, the United States has by far the most serial killers per capita of anywhere in the world. According to sociologist Julia West, who has written extensively about serial killers, the culture of America fosters serial killing, particularly because of the incredible notoriety given by the press to people who commit murder. Serial killers are sensationalized, they have fans, they become celebrities overnight. According to criminologist Sarah Hodgkinson and colleagues, in a review of serial killing research published in 2017, serial killing has an enduring fascination with the public, but the disclosure is dominated by reductionist and individualized accounts. These accounts perpetuate a number of misleading stereotypes about the serial killer and hides the diversity this form of homicidal behavior takes. Serial killing is such a low-frequency event that it's difficult to get useful data that can help us see patterns. On top of that, the academic literature on serial killing is limited. Hodgkinson and colleagues argue that we need to talk about why people commit acts of serial killing within wider sociocultural contexts. In order to understand serial killers, we must first try to understand the societies they live in. Serial killing is a crime that is hard to understand, and it's made harder by the lack of available data. Although it's difficult to know, serial killers are sought to largely kill for the same reasons as those who have only one murder victim. Some kill because they enjoy it, others because they are lonely, and others over perceived slights. When we start to scratch below their scary surface, even the worst killers turn out to be human beings. And looking at the data, it seems that humans largely kill for the same reasons that they do many other things: to find human connections, to protect their families, to achieve their goals, to acquire things they think they need. They do it to deal with basic human emotions like anger and jealousy, lust and greed, betrayal and pride. Those who study the brains of convicted murderers might argue that these individuals exhibit fundamental human flaws in a stronger or more disinhibited way. But if we believe that, our evolutionary researchers, from the beginning of this chapter, we find that probably all of us are capable of murder. If your murder fantasies were deeper and you had less to lose, you too might act on them. Maybe the only difference between you and a serial killer is the fully functioning prefrontal cortex, enabling you to inhibit behaviors when others cannot. We fear death, so it comes as no surprise that we fear those who murder. But as Socrates once said, nobody knows death, nobody can tell, but it may be the greatest benefit of mankind, and yet men are afraid of it, as if they know certainly that it were the greatest of evils. Let us not confuse our fear of death with justification for dehumanizing people who have inflicted it. And as Friedrich Nietzsche said, he has conceived the evil enemy, the evil one, and this in fact is his basic concept, from which he then evolves as an afterthought and pendant, a good one himself, on the genealogy of morality. And this leads us to the end of part 2.